let's try and like get to 13F because this was something I really wanted to drill into. Was like you said that it was used illegally by the Federal Reserve on like numerous occasions. So do you want to explain what you meant by that in maybe more detail? Because I can't
Yeah,
remember the
for
exact
sure.
figures.
Absolutely. And first, let me just try to do like an elevator synopsis of what I think you just so poetically and brilliantly demonstrated. And so interesting to hear this on the other side of the pond, even though that was quite frankly my perception, right? But to hear it from you firsthand is really validating for me because let's just take a quick snapshot at what's happening, right? You know your history. You know how ridiculous the beginning of the trigger that led to World War One. You know
Yes.
that it was just like it hit the
Franz
fan,
Ferdinand, the Black
right?
Hand Gang.
Right, because of 100 years of whatever evolved to that point that this put that moment in play. And look at what's been going on with your energy crisis, with what's going on with the war in Ukraine, with Putin talking about potentially a dirty bomb, maybe a limited nuclear strike, which what would happen after that? Okay, we are in a calamitous time because of what I'm telling you again. And I appreciate you teeing up the question because again, I want you all to think about singularity when it comes to Federal Reserve Act 13.3. So the entire system blew up. The neoliberal system, the 4 decades long march between Reagan and Thatcher that winds up with all of these things that circumnavigated really the notion of free markets. And what it really did was put in, big money monarchies and big law firms to create, the ones who are going to produce for next to nothing, to be able to maintain our, the myth, the facade of our consumer society. Meanwhile, we got rid of the golden goose, right, which was our ability to produce everything that we consume. Okay, so that's all out the window. And what does it lead to? It leads to a system that's unsustainable. This does not make sense. You cannot provide liar's loans to guys that came over the border from Mexico that are picking in the fields a $700,000 loan. I'm sorry, that happened. I'm not blaming the victims. Good for those guys who got the freaking jacuzzi in California for 10 minutes before they got blown up. But the bottom line is that was to maintain the facade of these fees and this engine of fraud and deception that blew up the world, that was based and predicated on literally, at that time, $600 trillion in world derivatives. That is now, I think, $1.4 quadrillion in derivatives. That's the number, and that's notional value. Okay, so it's out of control, and that's what happens when you take the cops off the beat and you get rid of character and credibility. It leads to a freaking full-on, massive rape fest, and that's what these guys have been getting away with forever. And so, Federal Reserve Act 13.3 and the statutes. Initially, it's a lender of last resort. The idea, if you're a nation as powerful as the United States, you've got huge industry, you've got amazing collateral, you've got amazing natural resources, you've got unbelievable productive capacity, and all of that is valued in something. You end up basically during the Keynesian time, World War II, you sell bonds, you get everybody's buying, they get, very conservative, they go all into the war effort, and it created this incredible value. And that's what the United States ended up with after, with you guys winning World War II, but we didn't have to rebuild our country like you guys did. We were in the pole position to where we could become this superpower because we were helping to rebuild the world, right? Mm. So fast forward to where we are with Federal Reserve Act 13.3 in 2009. So as many people might remember, we had a big, what I would call in retrospect, because I'm the only one that's going to tell the world this, particularly those of you in the United States paying attention to this, we had this huge smoke and mirrors dog and pony show in Congress featuring Hank Paulson, who was the Secretary of the Treasury who came out of Goldman Sachs, Timothy Geithner, who was the head of the New York Federal Reserve, who was basically supposed to be a regulator, but was just a yes man to this system that was basically about to blow up the world. This all came out of Alan Greenspan time. Alan Greenspan was our Federal Reserve chairman. He used to speak like Chauncey Gardner in a way that was like everybody thought he was this mythos like genius. Meanwhile, what you don't understand is he was a product of coming out of Charles Keating's largest bankruptcy in the United States in history at that time, which was Lincoln Continental, which was a fraud scheme. So this guy becomes the head of the Federal Reserve. Next thing you know, as it turns out, and this is the biggest mythology of all, right? So everybody in the country is trying to scrapple with, if they're coming to this sort of consternation about the Federal Reserve, it's like, well, wait a second. The Federal Reserve is independent. It has to be independent because if Congress was in charge of the Federal Reserve, then they'd use it for their political outcome, right? If there's a bunch of poor people that could, amass in numbers that demand that Congress give them what they want, then that's the thing that they're trying to prevent for the so-called stability of the broader economy. Okay, that's the kind of idea. The Federal Reserve was created to create the the lack of the ups and downs of what was happening in the economy before that, and especially all the different currency trades, to create a monetary base and a central currency to create stability. And they were a bunch of technocrats that weren't looking at this through a political ideology to maintain supply and demand. That's the idea. That's the myth. But when you get to after the Great Depression, the Federal Reserve had a couple of changes with the statute that it provides lender of last resort capacity to specific banks within the financial system that are supposedly under the FDIC regulation. But the idea is, and this is the common sense calculus, is if you're in war, you want your military to get funding. If you are in a famine, you want your farms and your agricultural capacity to be able to provide, fuel for, sustenance for your population, housing, so on and so forth, right? Nowhere does it say in the statutes, my friend. Nowhere does it say in the statutes, is particularly when lending is all predicated on the value of collateral. That's, again, underwriting, right? So nowhere does it say in these statutes anywhere that the full faith and credit of the United States is there to bail out a Ponzi scheme criminal shadow bank that its entire portfolio of collateral was worth zero, that you're going to then step up and provide $30 trillion in 2009, this capacity to smash and grab. And then that's led to another, it looks to me like a somewhere in the $30 to $50 trillion range since 2009. It's our system. And it's gone to the richest 1% or the multinationals or anybody who can prop up their assets, including oligarchs from Russia, right? That's the story. That's not an economy that is a real economy based on the fluctuations of production, And so it is central planning. What it is I tell everybody, that in this whole ideological space, do you want to be communist? Do you want to be fascist? Do you want to be Democrat? Whatever, man. What this is corporate fascism undergirded by a criminal syndicate. That's the shadow power that has complete control. And this is not Alex Jones mythologizing stuff that he doesn't know talk about, because that's another part of American media that drives me nuts. Morons getting paid $50 million a year to lie to people.
I don't think he's on 50 million. But yeah.
Well, that's what they said. But I've got tens of thousands of hours in this thing dealing with, and I work with the the FBI, the DOJ, the SEC, the good guys in there. Trust me, there's bad guys too. Same with AGs across the country, same with the top whistleblowers. We got the evidence. We put the whole thing on a silver platter that shows you exactly what this is. It's at www.thecon.tv. And what I'm trying desperately to do is that there were tens of millions of people in the United States that got devastated by 2008. Right? They got set up. A lot of people got into these loans because they don't know anything about financialization. A lot of them were actually a bunch of criminals that bit off more than they can chew. But even though you could take the worst of the worst and put them in this matrix, they didn't create the matrix. They're just getting tooled by it. The matrix is this hierarchy of this system, which is run by the CEOs through control fraud, through all of these different variables that create deceptive acts and practices, which is a fictional economy that ultimately led to this blow up where the Federal Reserve pumps money that you've said before, and many of your guys, you're just digitizing money into existence. Yeah, for what purpose? To go as to the primary dealers through banknotes that they can then loan against. But here's the other caveat to that. The Federal Reserve has been purchasing since 2009 mortgage-backed securities that are made up of this underwriting, that sawdust, that destroyed millions of people that are real life and blood. People like Addie Polk in our series, who shot herself 5 times in the chest. She was an African-American woman who was 91 years old, who basically was the American dream. Her and her husband came out of the Great Migration out of the South, out of Alabama, wound up in the industrial Midwest because of the exodus of white workers during World War II. They got their piece of the American dream. They owned their house. Presumably, she refinanced her house after her husband died, but she got set up in what was known as straw buying. So you can forge paperwork to where people behind the scenes can act like they're you, where they can get loans. And then when you don't pay those loans back, then the guys are going to come foreclose on you, which is what happened to Addie Polk. And she's one of millions of victims like this that were targeted. And by the way, the Federal Reserve was mandated by Congress to regulate these markets. So in 2003, 4, and 5, and I have this evidence, there were women that were in charge of investigating this. These women were some of the top academics and attorneys and investigators in the country. And they weren't solely women, but the ones that I interacted with were, because they went on to create what was known as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau with Elizabeth Warren. These were the country's top people at this. They put on a silver platter all of the evidence that was then worked through the channels of the Federal Reserve, through through the FOMC, to Ned Gramlich, who was the head of the Federal Reserve of Philadelphia, who presented the evidence to Alan Greenspan, who was mandated by Congress to regulate these markets, and he didn't. He chose Ned Gramlich, told Ned Gramlich, I'm not going to do anything about it, walked away from all of the evidence. 3 years later, he goes through the outdoor. Basically, Bernanke comes in. We have the freaking meltdown. And then all of a sudden, Paulson, Bernanke, and Geithner are basically telling the American people, we need $700 billion from Congress. Nobody in the United States had ever heard that much money before. We were all like, oh my God, what are you talking about? We're going to give Wall Street $700 billion for blowing up the world? Yeah, that's a real problem. We got to do it because the global system's going to blow up. So we do it. They get it through. It's called moral hazard. It was TARP, Troubled Assets Relief Program. But what it ultimately revealed, and what I know, and what I'm telling you about Federal Reserve Act 13.3, was they backdoored the Federal Reserve to Wall Street, where they gave them $30 trillion. Let's put that in comparison. The whole country was flipping out about $700 billion. Meanwhile, they backdoored it and they gave $30 trillion to the system that blew everybody up illegally.
That's 15 times the GDP of the United Kingdom. It's like, what? And those stories, like Ali Pogue, it makes my fucking blood boil. It really does, because like people should give a fuck, you know. That's the long shot. I mean, it's just one of millions.
Decency? Do we not have any dignity? Do we not? I mean, see, this is the whole thing about. See, we know that capitalism supposedly, was the great turning from feudalism, right? Mm-hmm. That's the whole idea. So capitalism gives everybody supposedly an opportunity, to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and become this mythologized, American dream sort of Horatio Alger story. And there are plenty of stories that appear to be that way, mm-hmm. but that's not the whole system. But at the end of the day, you wind up with this situation where, again, when you've got free money into the system through a completely perverted criminal system, that ultimately then the Fed is buying these bonds. And so why we're going to the Fed is all of these victims, like, so for example, at the insurrection, when Donald Trump's, and this is the big question everybody in the United States should ponder, is like, who paid for all of these guys who came out of, these mercenary groups like Blackwater, hint, to show up at the Fed, Congress, to do this insurrection, these muscle guys on the front that were going toe to toe with the police, while the Reserve, the Federal Reserve didn't show up when they were all over the place for Black Lives Matter. Think about that, for example.
Hey everyone, thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time.